Hi, my name is Ken Marino. I'd like to speak today about the politics of care and developing a politic of care and what that would mean in the United States. So the COVID-19 virus has really pointed to some of the fundamental problems in American culture with healthcare. So what I'm talking about and what feminist writers talk about when they say a politic of care, it's an attitude in our culture about our ethical responsibility towards each other. So some people would say that we don't have an ethical responsibility towards each other, and other people would say we do. So Eva Kittay starts with this idea of what she calls vulnerability, that we are all some mother's child. And what she's saying by this is basically that we are all vulnerable to being in need of care at any time in life. We come into this world as some mother's child, needing of care, being helpless, and we will ultimately go out of this world probably also needing care, being in some senses helpless, and not being able to take care of ourselves. Now, in between those 2 points, at any point of our life, we could become in need of care. Being hospitalized, being in an accident, which causes us to rely on others to take care of our basic needs. So recently, I've been in a situation where I've been interacting a lot with care workers who work with the elderly. And these are people who do this as a calling, and they really feel like they have a special talent, but it's not a talent that in our culture we really value. We don't give these people a salary that's commensurate with the work they do. We don't give them the kind of support that they would need, which would not only mean time off and vacations and a salary that would support that they could do things to reinvigorate themselves with their time off. But we also don't give them the type of support that they would need emotionally and intellectually. So if you're a caregiver who basically your day-to-day job is to take care of the elderly, for example, there is some point in your care where the person who you're taking care of will probably pass. And if you're dealing in an institutional situation like a nursing home or like a assisted living facility, this is happening consistently. The people that you're caring for are consistently passing away. And so how do we look at these realities in our life, and how do we create a culture in which care is the seedbed that leads out and blossoms into the leaves of how we live our life? Chief concerns that feminist writers have with care workers is that people engage in this activity by choice, because in a lot of situations people don't have the opportunity to engage in care by choice. So if you're in a situation where a family member is in need of care and might be long-term care, usually somebody has to step up to the plate and take care of that person. So when Eva Kittay and other feminist writers talk about vulnerability, they're talking about the fact that we can all become vulnerable to needing care, but we're all vulnerable in the sense that we are all in a situation where we might have to give care. And then where are the boundaries towards which we are responsible in giving care becomes the question of how we develop a politic of care. So if you think about the COVID-19 epidemic, you have people who are on the line now who are risking their lives. Many are getting sick and some are dying. Is that really an ethical politic of care? Is that what we should expect from people who are in caregiving roles? Caregivers should put their life in danger. So we need to come up with a politic of care where people have a choice. And this is a problem because usually when we're called to act in care, we don't have a choice. If somebody falls and we pick them up, we don't really have a choice. We are impelled by compassion and empathy to help them. So we ask the question, where does our responsibility begin and end? Now we could think about this. It's a very, very fundamental question in the Judeo-Christian ethic. Jesus talks about the Good Samaritan, who was the person who was the person who cared for the person who had been robbed and left on the side of the road, the Good Samaritan. This is really what the Bible is about. People might say a lot of other things like, well, God has these pandemics, and then, it's because people have sinned and the weakest will be weeded out. The people who don't believe, that's not what it's about. It's about the exact opposite. If anything, a pandemic calls us to care for other people. Not to say, well, other people, they don't really believe like I believe, or, they didn't take care of themselves, or blah, 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 blah. So therefore, I don't have responsibility. It really asks us, what is our responsibility? And so if anything, that's what the question that a pandemic is going to ask. So we view this kind of care as something that is part of a segment of American society. But the recent COVID crisis has really made us see how care is a fabric that is the foundation for society. Who cares for us? Well, the person who makes a meal for us cares for us. The people who put groceries on the shelves care for us. The people who are cleaning up after the doctors and nurses, cleaning up the grocery stores, care for us. The people who are picking the fruits and vegetables for us, the farmers, the truck drivers, the people who process the food. There is this mass network of caregivers without which we cannot survive. So our notion of how vulnerable we are to changes in basic functions in society is really becoming clear to us. So there is a very well-known philosopher, Paul Riceour, who came out with this book, and it was called The Self as Another. And what he is arguing against is the concept that we are subjective individuals. He argues that actually how our identity develops is not from some abstract thought process, some rational thought process that is always the same throughout our life. It is in constant flux, developing in the way that we relate to other people. And sometimes we're relating to people in ways that have moral and ethical dimensions, and this defines and develops our moral self. Gets it again to the idea of who is the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan is the person who cared for, and that is part of their character. Their character is somebody who is a caregiver, who cares about what happens to other people. So what the criticism of Riceour's book was, some people asked, well, then what are the boundaries to how I am defined through other people? And this is really interesting to our question of where is our politic of care? Where is our ethical responsibility? Where does it begin and where does it end? So my idea here is to give us some questions and ask some questions that we can contemplate. We have a very strong libertarian fabric in American society. And Ayn Rand, who is one of the chief figures in libertarianism, actually has a book called The Value of Selfishness, in which she argues that we don't have any moral responsibility to other people. Our first moral responsibility is to ourselves and to our own happiness. And our happiness does not interfere with the happiness of others. So this is very easily debunked, and we're seeing this now. When I have a factory and I dump my waste into the water that somebody else is drinking water, I might say, well, my responsibility is to myself, it's to my stockholders, but that is not an ethic of care for the people who need that water. That is a very, very unethical practice. And so when we start to address these notions of an ethic of care, the first question we come up against is empowering those who are marginalized. because the people who are usually in need of care are the people who are most marginalized. So we might say, well, I don't really have responsibility towards other people, but we are vulnerable. So if I am in a car and I'm doing 90 miles an hour and I end up getting hurt, somebody is going to have to care for me. Somebody is probably going to have to care for me for a very long time when I get out of the hospital. And I might be in a situation where I'm never able to care for myself again. So the idea that we can interact in life in a way that our actions do not affect each other is just not, it's intellectually dishonest. So if I don't want to wear a safety belt or wear a helmet and say, well, that's my right. Well, if I get hurt, that is affecting other people's lives. They have to care for me. Now, what we would say then is, well, we should just leave you on the side of the road. If you're doing 90 miles an hour and you get into an accident, we should just leave you on the side of the road. And people do argue for this. But when we're getting into the Judeo-Christian ethic, that is really in many ways the ethical foundation for this culture, amongst many other things, but it is a very powerful ethic because it is about an ethic of care. The Good Samaritan parable is not just a parable that is kind of adjacent to the story of the Bible. This is the story of the Bible. You know, Jesus says, love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself. That comes right out of Deuteronomy. The great prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, they're always talking about the problems that the Israelis are having is because they're not taking care of the most vulnerable. That's what they're talking about. That is the great sin that cultures inhabit that leads to their downfall. So, we're talking about a politic of care that is a foundational fabric of a society with social cohesion. And the COVID crisis really gives us a really good time to think about what it would really mean for us to have a culture where care is at the center rather than selfishness, where care is at the center rather than an attitude that says, I don't care. I don't have to care. There was a person that was wearing a garment on the back of which said, I don't care. Well, that is indicative of what we're seeing now. We're not seeing a lot of empathy in the structures of power. As a matter of fact, with the COVID crisis, I haven't seen any empathy coming out of the centers of power in this country. It's all about getting back to work and getting the economy going. Now, those are very important dynamics, but they're not as important as people's health. And secondly, they're not contradictory to people's health. People cannot work if they're not well. People should not be put in an environment where they are working that puts them at danger of sickness or even death. So where is our politic of care? How do we care for people? They're very easily solved by just having proper testing at this point. So these problems are not really that hard to solve. We need to shift the way we think from selfishness, from putting business and money first, to putting care first and putting the values of people and others first. And so, when we're looking now at the myriad and framework of care that is needed in this society, just for us to live from day to day, the truck driver, the mailman, the nurse, the grocery worker, all of this network of people, we need to start valuing them, and that's what we're seeing. We need to start realizing that it is service and care that is the foundation of a just society. And we need to start asking what that means to us now, because we're not going to be able to answer the questions that are going to come up again, that we're going to come up against until we change our framework about how we value the care and our moral responsibility towards other people. Thank you.